For Victoria Hartford, the perfect table at Boston's most exclusive restaurant was about to become the stage for her greatest humiliation. Her carefully curated world of luxury real estate and social influence came crashing down in a matter of minutes on that fateful Friday evening. The man she had just berated for his apparently slow service stood silently as she demanded to speak to the owner. When he finally spoke, his quiet response would shatter everything she thought she knew about power and respect. The decorated Navy SEAL she had just insulted wasn't just a server. He owned the entire establishment, and his next words would change her life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Hartford's world was built on appearances. At 42, she had mastered the art of projecting success in every aspect of her life. Her position as Senior Vice President of Client Relations at Boston's premier luxury real estate firm afforded her the lifestyle she had always dreamed of, and she wore it like a perfectly tailored designer suit. Her Beacon Hill townhouse, her Mercedes S-Class, and her meticulously maintained image were all carefully chosen pieces of the narrative she had constructed. Every morning, Victoria's routine began with precision. Her alarm would sound at exactly 6 a.m., though she was usually awake before it rang, her mind already cycling through the day's agenda. Her morning workout with her personal trainer was non-negotiable, followed by a carefully crafted breakfast of organic produce and imported proteins. Her appearance was a testament to this dedication. Not a single silver hair out of place in her expertly styled bob, her makeup always professional yet striking, her wardrobe selected from only the most exclusive boutiques. Success, in Victoria's world, was measured by control. She prided herself on her ability to manage every situation, to anticipate problems before they arose, and to ensure that everything in her sphere of influence adhered to her exacting standards. Her colleagues both admired and feared her attention to detail, knowing that nothing less than perfection would suffice. She had built her reputation on being able to handle the most demanding clients, the most complex deals, and the most challenging situations with unflappable composure. Her social circle was equally curated. She was a regular at the city's most exclusive events, where she moved through crowds with practiced ease, her networking skills as refined as her taste in wine. She served on multiple charitable boards, though her involvement was more about maintaining appearances than any genuine desire to effect change. Every relationship, every interaction, was evaluated through the lens of its potential value to her carefully constructed world. What few people saw was the cost of maintaining this perfect facade. Victoria's relationships, while numerous, remained superficial. Her dinner parties were legendary for their impeccable execution, but devoid of genuine warmth. Even her marriage had ended 3 years ago. Her ex-husband, finally tired of living in a world where spontaneity and genuine emotion were viewed as weaknesses to be controlled. This particular Friday evening found Victoria preparing for dinner at Azure, Boston's newest and most talked-about restaurant. She had been trying to secure a reservation for weeks, seeing it as essential to maintaining her status among her peers. The fact that she had finally managed to get a table during prime dinner hours was a point of pride, another small victory in her ongoing campaign to remain at the top of her social game. As she applied the final touches to her makeup, Victoria mentally rehearsed her evening. She would be dining with Catherine Palmer, wife of one of Boston's most prominent developers, and securing her friendship could prove invaluable for future business dealings. Every detail had to be perfect, every moment choreographed to create the right impression. Victoria had even called ahead to ensure they would have the best table in the house. Anything less would be unacceptable. What Victoria couldn't know was that this evening would shatter her carefully constructed world in ways she never could have anticipated. The lessons that awaited her at Azure would force her to confront truths about herself that she had spent years avoiding, and the person who would trigger this transformation was someone she would have normally overlooked entirely. As she stepped into her Mercedes, checking her reflection one final time in the rearview mirror, Victoria Hartford had no idea that she was about to learn the difference between the power she thought she held and the true strength that comes from a life of service and sacrifice. The restaurant she was about to enter would become more than just another exclusive venue to conquer. It would become the stage for a profound change in how she saw the world and her place in it. Azure wasn't just another restaurant in Boston's competitive dining scene, it was the talk of the city. Its mysterious owner had transformed a historic brick building in the heart of Back Bay into what critics were calling the most innovative dining experience on the East Coast. The waiting list for reservations stretched months into the future, and even Victoria's considerable influence had barely secured her a prime-time table. As her Mercedes pulled up to the valet stand, Victoria took a moment to appreciate the restaurant's understated elegance. The building's restored facade was highlighted by subtle blue lighting that made the century-old bricks seem to glow from within. A simple sign in brushed steel displayed the restaurant's name, its minimalist design speaking to the exclusivity of the establishment. The line of luxury vehicles at the valet station confirmed what Victoria already knew. This was exactly where she needed to be seen. The maître d' greeted her by name, another small victory in her carefully orchestrated evening. "Ms. Hartford, welcome to Azure. Mrs. Palmer has already arrived and is waiting at the bar." Victoria allowed herself a small smile. Arriving 7 minutes after her dinner, companion was a calculated move. Not so late as to be rude, but just late enough to establish her importance. The bar area was a study in sophisticated design. Steel and glass merged seamlessly with exposed brick, while subtle lighting created intimate spaces within the larger room. Catherine Palmer sat at the bar's prime corner spot, exactly where Victoria would have chosen herself. She was nursing what appeared to be a signature cocktail, its deep blue color matching the restaurant's aesthetic. "Victoria, darling," Catherine rose to air-kiss her cheeks, her enthusiasm just a touch too practiced to be genuine. "Isn't this place absolutely magnificent? Thomas tried to get us in for weeks before he finally had his assistant call in a favor." Victoria smiled, letting just a hint of smugness show through. "I know the challenge. Fortunately, I have my ways." She signaled the bartender with the subtle efficiency of someone used to immediate service. "I'll have the Azure Martini," she said without bothering to look at the menu. She had, of course, researched the restaurant's signature drinks well in advance. As they waited to be seated, Victoria scanned the room with practiced precision. She noted the mix of old money and new tech wealth, the subtle displays of affluence that marked Boston's elite. Everything was exactly as it should be, until her gaze fell on something that disrupted the perfect tableau. A man in his mid-30s stood near the kitchen entrance, speaking quietly with a member of the waitstaff. His posture was military straight, but his attire seemed oddly casual for his position. Dark jeans paired with a simple black button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. What caught Victoria's attention wasn't his appearance so much as the quiet authority he carried. The server he was speaking to listened with complete attention, nodding occasionally. "That's not very professional," Victoria murmured, more to herself than to Catherine. "The staff should be properly dressed, especially in a place like this." She made a mental note to mention it in her inevitable online review. The maître d' appeared at their side. "Ladies, your table is ready, if you'll follow me." He led them through the main dining room, a space that managed to feel both grand and intimate. The table he showed them to was perfectly positioned, visible enough to be seen by the right people, but private enough for sensitive conversation. Victoria settled into her chair, carefully arranging herself for maximum effect. Everything was going according to plan, but something about that casually dressed man nagged at her. In her world, appearance was everything. Success had a uniform, and that man's attire violated every rule she lived by. "I heard the owner is quite mysterious," Catherine said, picking up her menu. "No one seems to know much about him. Apparently, he's never given a single interview, just lets the food and atmosphere speak for themselves." Victoria's interest piqued. She loved having information others didn't. "Really? How intriguing. I'll have to ask around my circles." She made another mental note to dig deeper into this mystery owner. Information was currency in her world, and this seemed like a valuable piece to acquire. As they perused their menus, Victoria couldn't help but notice that the service seemed different from other high-end restaurants she frequented. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency that felt more purposeful than performative. There was none of the usual fawning. She was accustomed to just precise, professional service delivered with an almost military precision. Under normal circumstances, Victoria would have appreciated such efficiency, but something about the atmosphere made her feel slightly off balance, as if the usual rules she played by didn't quite apply here. It was an unfamiliar sensation, and Victoria Hartford did not like unfamiliar sensations. Little did she know, this slight discomfort was just the beginning. The evening she had planned so carefully was about to veer dramatically off course, and that casually dressed man she had dismissed would play a pivotal role in what was to come. Her perfectly orchestrated world was about to collide with a reality she never expected to encounter in a place like Azure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evening progressed with the kind of measured elegance Victoria expected from a restaurant of Azure's caliber, but small details continued to needle at her carefully maintained composure. The wine list had arrived promptly, but their server, a young woman with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place, hadn't hovered nearby, waiting for their selection, as Victoria was accustomed to. Instead, she had simply said, "Take your time. I'll be back when you're ready," and moved away to attend to other tables. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly at this departure from the usual script. In her experience, proper service meant anticipating needs before they arose, not waiting to be summoned. She watched as the server moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, noting how she seemed to lack the usual formality Victoria associated with fine dining. "The wine list is quite impressive," Catherine remarked, running her finger down the leather-bound menu. "Though I must say, their organization is unusual. I've never seen a list arranged quite like this before." Victoria glanced at her own menu and frowned slightly. Rather than being arranged by price point, her preferred method of navigation, the wines were grouped by regions and then subdivided by their compatibility with various dishes. It was logical, she had to admit, but it made it harder to quickly identify the most expensive options, which was usually her strategy for impressing dinner companions. "Let's start with champagne," Victoria declared, deciding to stick with what she knew. The Cru Grand Cuvée should be appropriate. She used the tone that usually prompted immediate action from staff, but their server was nowhere in sight. Victoria's perfectly manicured nails drummed once against the table before she caught herself and stilled them. Catherine seemed not to notice Victoria's growing irritation, too absorbed in studying the menu. "Everything sounds amazing. Apparently the chef trained in both classical French cuisine and modern molecular gastronomy. But I heard he also spent time cooking in Navy mess halls of all places. Isn't that fascinating?" Victoria's lip curled slightly. Hardly the pedigree I'd expect from a restaurant of this caliber. She glanced around for their server again, her patience wearing thinner by the minute. The casually dressed man she'd noticed earlier was still visible, now speaking with another member of the staff near the bar. Something about his presence continued to irritate her, like a scratch on an otherwise flawless surface. When their server finally returned, Victoria was ready to assert her authority. "We've been waiting to order our champagne," she said, her tone carrying the weight of someone used to making others acknowledge their mistakes. "The Krug Grande Cuvée, and we'll need appropriate glasses, properly chilled." The server, her name tag read Amanda, didn't react to Victoria's tone. Instead, she smiled warmly and said, "The Krug is an excellent choice, though if you're interested, we have a small production champagne from a family vineyard that I think you might enjoy even more. It's not as well known, but it's exceptional." Victoria felt her carefully maintained smile freeze in place. Was this server actually suggesting she change her order? In her world, such a suggestion would be unthinkable. "I'm quite familiar with fine champagnes," she said coldly. "We'll stick with the Krug." Amanda nodded, unfazed. "Of course, I'll have that right out for you." She moved away with the same quiet efficiency Victoria had noticed earlier, showing neither offense at the dismissal nor the apologetic deference Victoria expected. "Well," Victoria said to Catherine, not bothering to lower her voice, "I suppose they're still working on their service standards. One would expect better training at these prices." She smoothed her napkin across her lap, a gesture that usually helped her regain her sense of control. Catherine seemed distracted, her attention drawn to the bar area. "The atmosphere is different here, isn't it, but in a good way. It reminds me a bit of that place we went to in San Sebastian. You remember the one with 3 Michelin stars but no dress code, where the owner insisted on treating everyone exactly the same, whether they were locals or celebrities?" Victoria did remember, and she hadn't cared for that place either. In her view, the whole point of establishments like this was to create proper hierarchy, to ensure that people like her received the deference they deserved. This subtle leveling of the playing field made her deeply uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The champagne arrived, presented with professional precision, but without the usual flourish Victoria expected. Amanda opened it efficiently, poured a small taste for Victoria's approval, and waited quietly. Victoria made a show of examining the color, the bubbles, and finally taking a small sip. It was, annoyingly, perfect, served at exactly the right temperature in immaculate glasses, but Victoria wasn't ready to let go of her irritation. As Amanda began to pour for Catherine, Victoria noticed that the casual man from earlier was now standing near the kitchen entrance, watching the dining room with an intensity that seemed at odds with his relaxed attire. The contrast between his presence and the restaurant's elegant atmosphere grated on her nerves even more. "Excuse me," she called out to Amanda, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "Could you explain why someone dressed so casually is being allowed to loiter in the dining room? It rather ruins the ambiance, don't you think?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Victoria felt a small surge of satisfaction at finally voicing her displeasure. What she didn't notice was the subtle change in Amanda's expression, a flicker of something that might have been amusement mixed with anticipation. She had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed evening was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about power, respect, and true authority. Amanda's pause was brief but noticeable, her professional demeanor never wavering despite Victoria's pointed comment. "I can assure you, ma'am, that everyone in this restaurant has a purpose and belongs here." Her voice remained steady, but there was an undertone of something else, pride perhaps, or contained amusement. Victoria wasn't satisfied with this response. Years of corporate leadership had taught her that allowing standards to slip, even slightly, was the first step toward mediocrity. "I'd like to speak to the manager," she said, using the tone that had made junior executives tremble. Immediately, Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the champagne forgotten. "Victoria, dear, perhaps we should just enjoy our evening. The food here is supposed to be extraordinary." "It's the principle of the matter," Victoria cut her off, her voice sharp. "A restaurant of this caliber should maintain certain standards." She turned back to Amanda, who hadn't moved. "Well, the manager?" "Of course," Amanda replied, with that same unflappable calm that had been irritating Victoria all evening. "I'll let him know right away." She moved toward the kitchen, where the casually dressed man still stood, observing the dining room. Victoria watched as Amanda approached him, speaking in low tones. To her increasing annoyance, instead of rushing to fetch a manager, the man nodded and began walking directly toward their table. His movement was fluid, purposeful, with none of the obsequious hurry Victoria expected from restaurant staff. "Surely he isn't," Victoria began, but stopped as the man reached their table. Up close, she could see details she'd missed from Ovar. A faint scar ran along his jawline, and his hands, though clean and well-kept, showed signs of hard use. His posture was impeccable, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes, a striking shade of grey, held an intensity that made Victoria's next words die in her throat. "Good evening, ladies," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I understand there's a concern about our dress code." The question was posed without defensiveness or apology, simply a direct inquiry delivered with professional courtesy. Victoria recovered quickly, years of boardroom battles having taught her never to show weakness. "Yes, there is. I was just commenting to your server about the inappropriate attire I've noticed. This is meant to be a fine dining establishment, is it not?" The man's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in those grey eyes. "It is indeed, though we find that true quality isn't always about external appearances." He paused, studying Victoria with an unsettling thoroughness. "I'm curious. What exactly about the attire you've observed seems inappropriate?" The direct question caught Victoria off guard. She was used to people either immediately agreeing with her complaints or offering profuse apologies. This calm inquiry felt like a challenge. "Well, for one thing," she gestured at his outfit, "your own attire hardly sets the proper example. In an establishment of this caliber, one expects a certain level of refinement." A few nearby diners had begun to pay attention to the exchange, though they tried to be subtle about it. Victoria was accustomed to being the center of attention, but something about these furtive glances made her uncomfortable. The man smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Refinement comes in many forms, ma'am. In my experience, true quality isn't about what you wear. It's about how you conduct yourself, how you treat others, and the standards you hold yourself to, not just in appearance, but in character." There was something in his tone, a quiet confidence that spoke of experiences far beyond restaurant management, that made Victoria's usual armor of social superiority feel suddenly thin. But she had spent too many years defending her position in the world to back down now. "That's a charming philosophy," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "but hardly appropriate for a high-end restaurant in Boston. I don't know how things are run wherever you came from, but here we maintain certain standards. Now, if you could please fetch your manager, someone who actually understands the level of service this establishment should provide, I'd appreciate it." The man's expression didn't change, but the temperature around the table seemed to drop several degrees. A small muscle in his jaw twitched, the first crack in his composed exterior, but when he spoke, his voice remained measured and controlled. "Ma'am," he said, placing his hands behind his back in what Victoria would later recognize as a military stance, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about who I am and what standards we value here at Azure." The moment hung suspended, like the second before a thunderclap. Victoria had no way of knowing that her next words would trigger a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of her carefully constructed worldview, forcing her to confront truths about herself and her assumptions that she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Victoria's words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. The dining room had grown oddly quiet, as if the other patrons could sense the weight of the moment. Even Catherine had stopped fidgeting with her napkin, her eyes darting between Victoria and the man standing at their table. "Perhaps," the man said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority, "we should be clear about who's maintaining standards here." He shifted his stance slightly, and in that small movement, Victoria caught a glimpse of something she hadn't noticed before, a subtle glint of metal beneath his collar. Not jewelry, but something else. Something that looked like military dog tags. "I am Marcus Sullivan," he continued, "and I own Azure." The statement was delivered without flourish or dramatic emphasis, just a simple declaration of fact that carried more impact than any emotional display could have achieved. Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her metaphorical feet. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she struggled to process this information. The casual man she had been criticizing, the one she had dismissed as inappropriate for this setting, was the mysterious owner everyone had been talking about. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Before opening Azure, I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL, serving with men and women who taught me that true worth isn't measured by what you wear or how much money you have, but by your actions and your character." His grey eyes held Victoria's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "The standards we maintain here aren't about pretense or social status. They're about excellence, respect, and service." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical force. Memories of her earlier comments about his appearance, her dismissive attitude, and her demands to speak to someone who actually understands, crashed over her in waves of mortification. She was accustomed to controlling every situation, to being the one who made others feel small and inadequate. But now she found herself on unfamiliar ground. Around them, other diners had given up pretending not to listen. Some wore expressions of satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Others showed embarrassment on Victoria's behalf, perhaps recognizing their own potential for similar misjudgments. Catherine's face had turned a shade paler. "Victoria," she whispered, "didn't you read the article in Boston Magazine? They did a whole piece on how Azure was founded by a decorated Navy SEAL who wanted to—" "That's quite all right, Mrs. Palmer," Marcus interrupted gently. "Not everyone takes the time to look beyond the surface." His words carried no hint of sarcasm, but their impact was unmistakable. Victoria's mind raced, searching for solid ground in this suddenly tilted reality. Her usual tactics, intimidation, social pressure, the weight of her position, seemed laughably inadequate against this man who had faced challenges she couldn't begin to imagine. Her carefully constructed world of social hierarchies and superficial power felt hollow in the face of his quiet strength. I didn't realize," she managed, hating how weak her voice sounded. The words felt insufficient, childish even, in the face of what she now understood. "No," Marcus agreed, "you didn't, and that's exactly the point I'm trying to make." He gestured around the restaurant, where his staff continued their efficient service despite the drama unfolding at table 7. "Every person you see here, every server, cook, and dishwasher, was chosen not for how they look or what social circles they move in, but for their character, their work ethic, and their commitment to excellence. Victoria noticed for the first time that the staff moved with a coordinated precision that spoke of rigorous training and absolute dedication. What she had initially dismissed as a lack of proper formality, she now recognized as purposeful efficiency. These weren't just restaurant workers, they were a team operating with the kind of synchronized purpose she had only seen in the most elite corporate environments. Several members of our staff are veterans, Marcus continued, his voice softening slightly. Others are civilians who share our values, but all of them understand that true service, whether to your country or to your community, isn't about appearances. It's about integrity, dedication, and respect for others, regardless of their status or position. The weight of her misjudgment pressed down on Victoria like a physical presence. She had walked into Azure believing she understood a power, believing her social position and wealth gave her the right to demand deference. Instead, she found herself face to face with a different kind of authority altogether, one built on sacrifice, service, and genuine leadership rather than superficial status symbols. The silence that followed Marcus's words seemed to stretch endlessly. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, feeling the weight of every eye in the restaurant upon her. Her world, so carefully constructed on the foundation of social status and superficial power, had just been turned upside down. The carefully applied makeup felt like a mask on her face. Her expensive designer dress suddenly seemed like a costume rather than armor. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Victoria Hartford found herself completely at a loss for words. Her usual arsenal of subtle put-downs, social leverage, and carefully crafted superiority had been rendered useless in the face of Marcus Sullivan's quiet authority. The man standing before her had commanded elite military units, had probably faced situations she couldn't even imagine, and here she was, having just lectured him about proper standards. Catherine's attempt to break the tension only made things worse. "Marcus, Mr. Sullivan, I've heard so much about your work with veteran rehabilitation programs. Isn't it true that Azure employs more veterans than any other restaurant in Boston?" Victoria watched as Marcus's expression softened slightly when he turned to Catherine. "Yes, that's correct. We believe in giving opportunities to those who've served. Many of our veterans find that the structure and teamwork here helps them transition back to civilian life." His voice carried genuine pride, not the artificial kind Victoria was used to hearing at charity galas and board meetings. The implications of this hit Victoria hard. She thought about Amanda, the server she had dismissed so readily. Had she served in the military too? Was that the source of her quiet confidence, her unflappable demeanor in the face of Victoria's condescension? How many other stories, how many other lives of service and sacrifice had she overlooked in her rush to judge and dismiss? A memory surfaced, unbidden. Her younger brother, Thomas, had enlisted in the army right out of high school. Victoria had been embarrassed at the time, had even tried to talk him out of it. "Our family doesn't serve in the military," she had told him dismissively. "We write checks to veteran causes. We don't actually join." Thomas had gone anyway, and they had gradually lost touch. When was the last time she had even spoken to him? Marcus must have noticed something change in her expression because his tone shifted slightly. "You know, Miss Hartford, one of the first things you learn in the SEALs is that appearances can be deceiving. The strongest member of my team wasn't always the one who looked the part. The best leader wasn't always the one with the most authoritative voice. We learn to judge people by their actions, their character, their willingness to put others before themselves." Victoria felt each word like a physical blow. How many times had she judged people solely on their appearance? How many potential connections, relationships, even business opportunities had she missed because she was too focused on maintaining her artificial standards? She began, then stopped, realizing she had no idea what to say. Her usual script of non-apologies and social deflections seemed hollow now. "I made assumptions," she finally managed, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I was wrong." The admission cost her something. Pride, certainly, but something else too. It was as if acknowledging this one mistake had created a crack in her carefully constructed facade, and through that crack, uncomfortable truths were beginning to seep in. Marcus studied her for a moment, his grey eyes seeming to see past her, exterior to something deeper. "Recognition of our mistakes is the first step toward growth," he said quietly. "In the SEALs, we had a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. It meant that growth, improvement, becoming better, it's all supposed to be challenging. If it's not challenging, you're not really growing." Victoria felt her throat tighten. When was the last time she had actually challenged herself to grow? Not just professionally or financially, but as a person. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, creating an image of perfection and power, that she had stopped allowing herself to be vulnerable, to learn, to change. The restaurant continued to operate around them, the quiet efficiency of Marcus's team uninterrupted by the drama at their table. Victoria noticed how the staff moved with purpose and dignity, each person seeming to know exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. There was no fawning, no artificial deference, just genuine service delivered with pride and professionalism. The contrast with her own approach to life was stark and uncomfortable. She had always believed that power came from making others feel small, that success was measured by how many people you could look down upon. But here was a man who had commanded elite military units, who had probably held literal life and death power over others, and he chose to lead through respect and example rather than intimidation. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down at their table, a move so unexpected that Victoria found herself straightening instinctively. The casual confidence with which he joined them spoke volumes. This was his domain, and he was completely comfortable in it. Despite her earlier criticism of his attire, she now noticed how his presence seemed to command the space without any need for formal trappings. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, one that made both Victoria and Catherine lean in slightly. "During my second deployment, I had a commanding officer who taught me something I've never forgotten. We were in a situation, details aren't important, but we were all exhausted, pushed to our limits. This CO, he noticed one of our youngest team members was struggling." Victoria watched as Marcus's eyes grew distant, seeing something far beyond, the elegant dining room of azure. Now, in some units, showing weakness wasn't acceptable, but this CO, he did something unexpected. Instead of berating the young SEAL or questioning his fitness for the team, he sat down next to him and shared his own water, even though supplies were limited. Then he told us all something I've carried with me ever since. Leadership isn't about being above others, it's about lifting them up. The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. How many times had she used her position to push others down rather than lift them up? How many assistants had she berated? How many junior executives had she humiliated, all in the name of maintaining her authority? "When I returned home," Marcus continued, "I saw how many of my fellow veterans struggled to find their place in civilian life. Not because they lacked skills or discipline, they had those in abundance. But because society often didn't know how to see past the surface, past the stereotypes of who they were or what they could do." Catherine nodded sympathetically, but Victoria barely noticed. She was too caught up in her own rapidly shifting perspective. She thought about the countless times she had dismissed people based on their appearance, their status, their failure to meet her arbitrary standards of success. "That's why I created Azure," Marcus said, gesturing to the restaurant around them. "Not just as a business, but as a mission. Every person who works here has a story of service, whether in the military or in their community. Take Amanda, for instance." He nodded toward their server, who was efficiently managing another table nearby. "Before joining us, she was a combat medic, saved countless lives in Afghanistan. Now she's putting herself through medical school while working here." Victoria felt her cheeks burn as she remembered her condescending treatment of Amanda earlier. The woman she had dismissed as just a server had probably faced more challenges and shown more courage in a single day of her deployment than Victoria had in her entire career. "Or Michael, our head chef," Marcus continued, pointing toward the kitchen. "Marine Corps veteran. Lost his leg in combat, learned to cook during his rehabilitation, and discovered he had a gift for it. Now he runs one of the most innovative kitchens in Boston, and he does it with more grace and skill than many chefs I've seen with twice his formal training." Each revelation felt like another crack in the wall Victoria had built around herself. She had walked into Azure believing she understood power, success, and status. Now she was learning that true strength often came in forms she had never bothered to recognize. "The thing about service," Marcus said, his voice growing softer but more intense, "is that it teaches you to see beyond yourself. In the SEALs, we learned quickly that individual ego gets people killed. Success comes from working together, from recognizing and respecting each other's strengths, from understanding that every person has value regardless of their rank or position." Victoria thought about her own leadership style, built on intimidation and the careful maintenance of hierarchy. She had always believed that keeping others off balance, making them feel inferior, was the key to maintaining control. But sitting here, listening to Marcus describe a completely different approach to power and leadership, she began to see the hollowness of her methods. "Your standards," Marcus said, fixing her with that steady gaze again, "aren't wrong because they're high. They're wrong because they're focused on the wrong things. True excellence isn't about wearing the right clothes or knowing the right people. It's about character, integrity, and the willingness to serve something larger than yourself." The truth of his words resonated deep within her, touching something she had buried long ago beneath layers of social conditioning and corporate armor. She remembered the young woman she had been before success had hardened her, before she had learned to judge her worth and the worth of others by such superficial measures. The weight of Marcus's words seemed to press Victoria back into her chair. The bustling restaurant around them faded into background noise as memories she had long suppressed began to surface. She thought of her brother Thomas again, remembering the look of disappointment on his face when she had missed his military graduation ceremony, claiming she had an important client meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, then corrected herself. "Marcus, I have a brother in the military. He's still alive, but we haven't spoken in years." The admission felt like pulling a thread on a carefully woven garment. Once started, it couldn't be stopped. "I didn't understand his choice to serve. I thought it was beneath our family's status." Catherine's sharp intake of breath reminded Victoria that she wasn't alone at the table, but somehow it didn't matter anymore. The carefully maintained facade was crumbling, and for the first time in years, Victoria felt no urge to rebuild it. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed understanding. "It's never too late to bridge that gap," he said quietly. "One thing military service teaches you is that time is precious, and regret is a heavy burden to carry." Victoria's throat tightened. "I wouldn't even know where to begin, the things I said to him." She trailed off, remembering her cutting remarks about his choice of service over college, her dismissive attitude toward his achievements, her gradual withdrawal from his life as their paths diverged. "You begin with honesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "In the SEALs, we had a saying, The only way out is through. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves. Amanda approached the table with practiced efficiency, setting down 2 glasses of water without being asked. Victoria noticed for the first time the slight scar on the server's wrist, partially visible beneath her sleeve, a reminder of her combat medic days, perhaps. How many lives had those hands saved? How many critical decisions had that mind made under pressure? "I've been so wrong," Victoria said, the words coming out in a rush, "about everything, about what matters, about what strength really means." She turned to Amanda. "I owe you an apology. The way I spoke to you earlier was inexcusable." Amanda's smile was genuine. "No apology needed, ma'am. We all have our learning moments." The grace in her response only made Victoria feel more ashamed of her earlier behavior. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You know what the hardest part of SEAL training was? It wasn't the physical challenges, though those were brutal. It was learning to break down the walls we built around ourselves, the ones that made us think we had to be invincible. That vulnerability was weakness." Victoria thought about her own walls, built so high and so thick that they had become a prison rather than protection. Every designer outfit, every powerful position, every social connection had been another brick in that wall, keeping others out, but also keeping her trapped in a role she had created for herself. "How do you do it?" she asked, surprising herself, with the vulnerability in her voice. "How do you maintain authority without—" She gestured vaguely at herself, at all the trappings of power she had wrapped herself in. "Real authority," Marcus replied, "comes from serving others, not dominating them. Every person in this restaurant, from the dishwashers to the executive chef, knows they're part of something bigger than themselves. They lead by example, not by intimidation." Catherine, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "It's remarkable," she said softly. "The atmosphere here. It's different from any other restaurant I've been to. There's a sense of purpose." Marcus nodded. "That's exactly what we aim for. Every veteran who works here brings their own story, their own strength. We're not just serving meals, we're showing that there's dignity in service, that true excellence comes from character, not status." Victoria felt tears threatening to form and blinked them back rapidly. She had spent so many years viewing tears as weakness, viewing any display of emotion as a failure of control. But now she wondered if perhaps she had been wrong about that too. "I'd like to learn," she said finally, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Not just about the restaurant, but about all of it, about what real leadership means. She paused, gathering her courage. "And I think I need to call my brother." Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. The simple admission of wanting to change, of needing to learn, had cracked something open inside her that couldn't be easily closed. Again, she felt raw, exposed, yet somehow lighter, as if laying down her armor had freed her from a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Your brother," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "Where did he serve?" The question was simple, but it made Victoria realize just how little she knew about Thomas's military career. He's in the army," she said, the inadequacy of her knowledge burning in her chest. "I should know more, shouldn't I? I should know his rank, his unit, where he's been deployed. What kind of sister doesn't even know these basic things about her own brother?" Catherine reached over and squeezed her hand, a gesture of support that would have seemed inappropriately familiar just an hour ago. Now Victoria found herself grateful for the human contact. "The good news," Marcus said, "is that acknowledging what we don't know is the first step toward learning. In SEAL training, they break you down completely before building you back up. Sometimes we need to strip away our preconceptions before we can truly grow." Victoria thought about her own. process of breaking down happening right here in this restaurant. Her carefully constructed worldview was crumbling, but instead of feeling threatened, she felt something else, anticipation, perhaps even hope. "Tell me about your team here," she said, surprising herself with her genuine interest. Not just their military backgrounds, but who they are, what they've taught you. A smile touched Marcus's eyes, and for the first time, Victoria noticed the fine lines at their corners, lines that spoke of both hardship and joy. "Take James, our sommelier," he said, nodding toward a distinguished-looking man discussing wine with guests at a nearby table. Marine Corps, served 20 years, lost his best friend in combat. After returning home, he found that his heightened sense of smell, something that had helped him detect danger in the field, gave him an extraordinary talent for wine. Victoria watched James at work, seeing him with new eyes. His elegant knowledge of wine, which she would have once seen as a mark of social refinement, now appeared as something deeper, a transformation of combat-honed senses into civilian expertise. "And there's Maria in the kitchen," Marcus continued. Army veteran, combat engineer, she approached cooking like she did explosives, with precise attention to detail and perfect timing. Now she's our pastry chef, creating desserts that look like works of art. Each story added another layer to Victoria's shifting perspective. She thought about her own employees, realizing she knew nothing about their lives beyond their roles. In her company, how many stories had she missed? How many talents had she overlooked because she was too focused on superficial markers of success? "The hardest part of running Azure isn't the business side," Marcus said, reading her thoughts. "It's ensuring that every person who works here knows their value, goes beyond their job title. We're not just a restaurant, we're a community. Every person here has faced challenges, shown courage, demonstrated resilience. They bring those qualities to everything they do." Victoria thought about her own management style, the sharp criticism, the constant demands for perfection, the way she used fear and intimidation to maintain control. "I've been doing everything wrong," she admitted. "I thought leadership was about making others feel small so I could feel big." That's not leadership," Marcus said firmly. "That's dominance. There's a crucial difference. Leadership is about lifting others up, about creating an environment where people can grow and excel. The strongest teams I served with didn't succeed because we feared our leaders. We succeeded because we respected them, because they brought out the best in each of us." Victoria nodded slowly, thinking about her own team back at the office. How many talented people had she driven away? How many opportunities for growth and connection had she missed because she was too focused on maintaining her position of power? "I want to learn," she said again, but this time with more conviction, not just about military service or restaurant management, but about real leadership, about building something meaningful. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Would you be willing to teach me?" The question hung in the air, vulnerable and sincere. Victoria Hartford, who had never asked for help in her adult life, who had built her career on projecting unwavering confidence, was openly admitting she needed guidance. Marcus studied Victoria for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as if gauging the sincerity of her request. In that moment of scrutiny, Victoria resisted her usual impulse to fill the silence with words, to take control of the conversation. Instead, she waited, understanding that this was another kind of test, one that had nothing to do with social status or power. "Learning takes many forms," Marcus finally said, his voice thoughtful. "In the SEALs, we had a saying, 'You don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of your training.' Real change isn't about grand gestures or sudden transformations. It's about consistent daily choices that gradually reshape who you are." He gestured to Amanda, who approached the table again. Would you be willing to share your story? He asked her. Amanda nodded, pulling up a chair with the same quiet confidence Victoria had noticed earlier. Before I was a server here, Amanda began, I was making split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. As a combat medic, you learn quickly that rank doesn't matter when someone's bleeding out. What matters is competence, teamwork, and the willingness to put others before yourself. Victoria listened intently, noticing how Amanda's posture changed subtly as she spoke about her service, spine straightening, shoulders squaring, voice carrying a quiet authority that had nothing to do with social status. When I first started working here, Amanda continued, I was struggling to adapt to civilian life. The stakes seemed so much lower, the purpose less clear. But Marcus helped me see that service is service, whether you're saving lives in combat or ensuring someone has a memorable evening with their family. It's about bringing your whole self to whatever you do. Marcus nodded. That's the first lesson of real leadership, understanding that every role has dignity, every person has value. The way you treated Amanda earlier, that was about your own insecurities, wasn't it? Your need to establish dominance in every situation. The question should have felt accusatory, but somehow it didn't. Victoria found herself nodding slowly. I've spent so long believing that respect comes from making others feel small, she admitted. I thought that's what power was. Real power, Marcus said, is about empowerment. It's about creating an environment where others can excel, where they feel valued and supported. He paused, considering something. Come back tomorrow morning, before we open. I want to show you something about how we really operate here. Victoria blinked in surprise. You mean that? You're willing to teach me? On one condition, Marcus replied, his expression serious. Before you come tomorrow, you need to make that call to your brother. Real leadership starts with facing our own failures, our own missed opportunities for connection. The thought of calling Thomas after so many years made Victoria's chest tighten with anxiety. What would I even say to him? The truth, Marcus said simply. In the military, we learn that sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest. I was wrong, I'm sorry. Help me understand. Catherine, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Victoria, remember when Thomas sent you that letter after his first deployment? The one you showed me but never answered. You still keep it in your desk drawer. Victoria felt her cheeks flush. She did indeed still have that letter, though she had never admitted to anyone how often she took it out and read it. How many times she had started to reply but stopped, trapped by her own pride and the persona she had created for herself. Tomorrow morning, then? Marcus asked, standing up. 7 a.m. Before you come, read that letter again. Really read it and make that call. His tone made it clear this wasn't just a suggestion. It was the price of admission for whatever lessons he was willing to teach. Victoria nodded, feeling both terrified and strangely exhilarated. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about how others perceived her, about maintaining her image or asserting her dominance. Instead, she was thinking about her brother's letter, about the words she had never allowed herself to say to him. One more thing, Marcus added, his expression softening slightly. Bring comfortable shoes. The kitchen floor isn't kind to designer heels, and you're going to learn about leadership from the ground up. Literally. The implications of his words sank in slowly. He wasn't going to just talk to her about leadership. He was going to show her, hands-on, what it meant to be part of a team that valued service over status. The thought was both humbling and exciting. Later that night, Victoria sat in her home office, the polished mahogany desk that usually represented her power and success now feeling more like a barrier. The bottom right drawer opened with a familiar smoothness, and there it was, Thomas's letter. the envelope worn at the edges from the many times she had handled it without ever finding the courage to respond. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The letterhead showed it had been written from a military base in Afghanistan, dated 3 years ago. The handwriting was distinctively Thomas's, neat but urgent, as if he had many things to say and limited time to say them. "Dear Vic," it began, using the childhood nickname she hadn't heard in years. "I know we haven't spoken since Dad's funeral, and maybe you won't even read this. But I'm sitting here, watching the sun rise over mountains that look nothing like home, and I can't stop thinking about all the things I wish I could tell you." Victoria's vision blurred as she continued reading. Thomas wrote about his unit, about the bonds formed in combat, about the kind of leadership that had nothing to do with titles or status. He described commanding officers who led from the front, who never asked their soldiers to do anything they wouldn't do themselves. "I wish you could see this side of military service," one paragraph read. "It's not what you think, not just following orders or sacrificing individuality. It's about finding your true self in service to others. Remember how you used to be, Vic? Before you started climbing the corporate ladder? You had such a big heart. You cared so deeply about people. Sometimes I wonder if you remember that version of yourself." The words hit her like physical blows. She did remember that version of herself, the young woman who had mentored struggling students in college, who had volunteered at homeless shelters, who had dreamed of making a real difference in the world. When had she lost that part of herself? Her phone sat on the desk, screen dark and imposing. Marcus's words echoed in her mind. "I was wrong, I'm sorry. Help me understand." Such simple phrases, yet they required more courage than any business negotiation she had ever handled. Before she could talk herself out of it, Victoria picked up the phone and dialed the number she still knew by heart. Each ring felt like an eternity. Then, "Hello?" Thomas's voice, deeper than she remembered, cautious but unmistakably her brother's. "Thomas?" Her voice cracked slightly. It's Victoria. Vic." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Victoria could hear background noise, what sounded like children playing, a dog barking. "Vic?" Thomas's voice held surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Is everything okay?" "No," she said honestly, surprising herself. "No, everything's not okay. I'm sitting here reading your letter from 3 years ago, and I need to tell you I'm sorry. I was wrong. About everything." She heard Thomas take a sharp breath. What brought this on? Victoria found herself telling him about Azure, about Marcus Sullivan, about the lessons in leadership and service she had learned in a single evening. The words poured out of her, unfiltered and raw, so different from her usual carefully calculated communications. "I didn't understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I knew what success looked like, what strength meant. But I was so wrong, Thomas. The way I treated you, the things I said about your choice to serve, I was wrong about all of it." "Vic," Thomas's voice softened, "you're my sister. I never stopped hoping you'd understand someday." "Tell me about it," she whispered. "Your service, your life. I want to know everything. I want to understand, really understand this time." For the next hour, Victoria listened as Thomas shared stories about his military career, about the men and women he served with, about the kind of leadership that had shaped him into the person he had become. She learned that he was now a lieutenant colonel, that he commanded his own unit, that he had earned commendations she had never known about. "You should meet my family," he said finally. "My wife Sarah, you'd like her, and the kids. Your niece and nephew. They should know their aunt." Victoria felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You have children? I'm an aunt?" "Madison is 6, and Tyler just turned 4, Thomas said. They love hearing stories about their crazy aunt who used to push their dad on the tire swing in Grandma's backyard. The mention of their childhood brought fresh tears. "I've missed so much," Victoria said. "I've wasted so much time." "Then, don't waste any more," Thomas replied simply. "You know what we say in the army. Forward march. You can't change the past, Vic, but you can choose your next step." At precisely 6:45 a.m., Victoria pulled into Azure's parking lot, feeling both exhausted and oddly energized. She had barely slept after her conversation with Thomas, her mind racing with everything she had learned about his life, his family, and the years she had missed. For the first time in recent memory, she hadn't spent her morning obsessing over her appearance. Instead of her usual designer suit, she wore black slacks and a simple button-down shirt, her hair pulled back practically. The comfortable shoes Marcus had recommended felt strange after years of stilettos. The restaurant's back entrance was already busy with activity. Delivery trucks were arriving and staff members moved with purposeful efficiency, unloading fresh produce, meats and other supplies. Victoria noticed that everyone seemed to pitch in, regardless of their position. There was none of the rigid hierarchy she was used to in corporate environments. Marcus stood by the door, clipboard in hand, checking deliveries. He looked exactly as he had the night before, and Victoria realized his casual attire wasn't about being underdressed, it was about being prepared to work. He nodded in approval at her practical outfit. "Right on time," he said, "ready to learn what real service looks like." Before Victoria could respond, he handed her an apron. "First lesson. Everyone here starts their day the same way, by contributing to setup. We're going to help Michael prep the kitchen." Victoria followed Marcus through the back entrance, immediately struck by how different the restaurant felt. In the morning light, the elegant dining room she had sat in last night was dark and quiet, but the kitchen was already humming with energy. The staff moved with synchronized precision, like a well-rehearsed dance. Michael, the head chef she had learned about the night before, looked up from where he was organizing the day's prep list. His prosthetic leg was visible below his chef's pants. But what struck Victoria most was his presence. He commanded the kitchen not through intimidation, but through quiet competence. "Victoria's here to learn," Marcus explained simply, "starting from the ground up." Michael nodded, his face serious. "Good. We need help with vegetable prep. Amanda will show you the ropes." Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety as Amanda approached, with a large box of vegetables. This wasn't her world. She had staff to cook for her, had never needed to prepare food for herself, let alone in a professional kitchen. "Everyone starts somewhere," Amanda said kindly, seeming to read her thoughts. "Here's your station. We'll begin with basic knife skills." For the next hour, Victoria stood at a prep station, learning how to properly hold a chef's knife, how to dice onions, julienne carrots, and prep various vegetables. Her first attempts were clumsy, the cuts uneven. In her corporate world, such imperfection would have been unacceptable, but here something was different. "Keep going," Amanda encouraged, when Victoria apologized for her messy cuts. "Nobody's born knowing this. What matters is the willingness to learn, to keep trying until you get it right." As she worked, Victoria noticed how the kitchen staff communicated. Brief, clear exchanges, acknowledgements of "yes, chef," or "behind you," or "sharp behind." There was a rhythm to it, a protocol that kept everyone safe and efficient in the tight space. "This is how we stay coordinated," Marcus explained, noticing her observation. "In the SEALs, clear communication could mean the difference between life and death. Here, it's about safety and efficiency, but the principle is the same. Everyone needs to work as one unit." Victoria thought about her own office, where communication was often about power plays and positioning. How much more efficient could her team be if they communicated with this kind of clarity and purpose? As the morning progressed, Victoria's hands grew sore. and her back ached from standing. But she noticed something else too, a sense of satisfaction, as her vegetable cuts became more uniform, as she began to find her rhythm in the kitchen's choreography. She was learning, improving, contributing to something larger than herself. "You're getting it," Michael said, inspecting her work. "But more importantly, you're listening, watching, trying to understand the whole operation. That's what matters." Marcus, who had been moving between different stations, checking on preparations and offering guidance where needed, returned to her station. "Notice how everyone here has a specific role, but also knows how to support others? That's real teamwork. It's not about who's in charge, it's about what needs to be done and who's best positioned to do it." Victoria nodded, thinking about how different this was from her usual approach to leadership. She had always believed that maintaining distance from grunt work was essential to preserving authority. But here was Marcus Sullivan, a decorated Navy SEAL and successful restaurant owner, helping to unload deliveries and prep vegetables alongside his staff. As the morning progressed, Victoria found herself drawn into the rhythm of the kitchen. Her arms ached from the unfamiliar work, and a small burn on her forearm from an accidental brush against a hot pan served as a badge of her initiation into this new world. But something else was happening too, something that went beyond the physical lessons of kitchen work. "Time for family meal," Marcus announced around 10 o'clock. Victoria had heard of this restaurant tradition, but had always dismissed it as inefficient. Now, watching the staff gather around a long table in the back of the kitchen, she understood its deeper purpose. "In the military," Marcus explained as they joined the others, "sharing meals builds unit cohesion. It's no different here. This is where we discuss the day ahead, share concerns, solve problems together. But more importantly, it's where we become more than just co-workers." The meal was simple, dishes made from prep trim and extras, but prepared with the same care as the restaurant's regular menu. Victoria noticed how the staff naturally integrated her into their circle, sharing stories and jokes without the artificial deference she was used to receiving. "First time I worked prep," a line cook named Jason shared, noticing her rubbing her sore shoulders. "I could barely lift my arms the next day. But you know what? Every motion you're learning now makes you part of our dance. In combat, we called it muscle memory. Here, it's the same principle. Your body learns the rhythms that keep everyone safe and efficient." Victoria found herself hungry in a way that went beyond physical appetite. These people had something she had been missing, a sense of genuine connection, of shared purpose. She thought about the lunches at her office, where junior staff members ate at their desks while executives dined at expensive restaurants, maintaining the hierarchy she had always thought was essential to leadership. "Tell us about your brother," Amanda suggested as they ate. "Marcus mentioned you spoke with him last night." Victoria felt a surge of emotion as she thought about her conversation with Thomas. "He's a lieutenant colonel now," she said, still amazed by how much she had missed. "Has 2 children I've never met. He told me about his command philosophy, how he leads his unit the way he was taught, by example and with respect." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Military leadership isn't about giving orders from behind a desk. It's about being in the trenches with your people, understanding their challenges, supporting their growth. Sound familiar?" He gestured around the kitchen where every staff member, regardless of position, contributed to the whole. After the meal, Victoria found herself working alongside Maria, the pastry chef. She watched in amazement as the former combat engineer approached her desserts with the same precision she had once applied to explosives. "In the army," Maria explained, while demonstrating how to properly measure ingredients, precision meant survival. Here it means excellence. Different stakes, same principle, attention to detail, respect for the process, understanding that every small action contributes to the final result. As they worked, Victoria found herself sharing her own story. Not the carefully curated version she usually presented, but the real one. She told them about growing up with Thomas, about their close relationship before her ambition had driven them apart, about the walls she had built around herself in pursuit of success. "You know what's interesting?" Maria said, showing Victoria how to properly fold chocolate into a mousse. "You kept building higher walls to protect your position, but all you did was isolate yourself. In the military, we learn that isolation is dangerous. The strongest position is one where you're connected to your unit, where you trust and are trusted in return." The lesson struck home. Victoria thought about her office, about the distance she maintained from her employees, about the loneliness of her supposed position of power. She thought about Thomas's letter, about his description of military leadership, about the connection and purpose he had found in service. "I've been doing everything backwards," she admitted, carefully folding the chocolate mixture as Maria had shown her. "I thought leadership was about being above others, but it's really about being among them, isn't it? About understanding their challenges because you've faced them yourself." Marcus, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "That's exactly right. Real leadership isn't about maintaining distance, it's about closing it. Every person in this kitchen knows I've done their job, faced their challenges, understand their perspectives. That's not weakness, it's the foundation of true strength." As the restaurant preparation continued toward opening time, Victoria found herself viewing everything through new eyes. The kitchen staff had begun their final preparations for lunch service, and the energy in the room had shifted, more focused, more intense, but still maintaining that underlying sense of unity she had observed all morning. "Watch this," Marcus said, gesturing to the kitchen staff's synchronized movements. "What do you see?" Victoria observed carefully, her business mind beginning to merge with her new understanding. They're all moving with purpose, but also awareness. Everyone seems to know exactly where everyone else is, what they're doing. It's like a dance, but more than that, it's like they're all parts of the same organism. Marcus nodded approvingly. "In the SEALs, we called it tactical awareness. And here, it's the same principle. Everyone understands not just their role, but how it fits into the larger mission. They're not just cooking, they're creating an experience, telling a story, serving a purpose larger than themselves." Victoria thought about her own office, about the rigid hierarchies and siloed departments. "I've been running my team all wrong," she realized aloud. "I've created competition instead of cooperation, fear instead of trust." "Tell me about your team," Marcus prompted, leading her to a quiet corner as the kitchen continued its preparations. "What would they say about your leadership if they could speak freely?" The question hit hard. Victoria thought about the high turnover rate in her department, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the way her employees seemed to brace themselves whenever she called them into her office. "They're afraid of me," she admitted, the truth feeling like glass in her throat. "I thought that meant I was doing my job well, maintaining authority, driving results. But now—" She gestured to the kitchen, where Michael was calmly guiding a new cook through a complex plating technique, his teaching style firm but encouraging. "Fear can drive short-term results," Marcus agreed, "but it kills innovation, loyalty, and true excellence. Look at Michael. He's not just teaching technique, he's building confidence, developing potential. That's what real leadership looks like." Victoria watched as the new cook successfully replicated the plating under Michael's guidance. The pride in both their faces spoke volumes about the power of this approach. "I have a team meeting tomorrow." "Morning," Victoria said suddenly. "Usually I use it to review targets, point out failures, maintain pressure. But maybe—" She paused, thinking. "Maybe it's time for a different approach." Marcus raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. What if, instead of just reviewing numbers, I asked them about their challenges, their ideas for improvement? What if I actually listened? The concept felt foreign but exciting. In fact, she pulled out her phone, opened her calendar, and began making changes. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew. "Cancelling my lunch meeting with the board," Victoria said decisively. "I'm going to stay and work through lunch service instead. I need to understand this more deeply." She looked up at Marcus. "That is, if you'll let me?" The pride in Marcus's expression reminded her of how Michael had looked at the new cook. "Now you're getting it. Understanding comes before change, and change comes before leadership." As the lunch hour approached, Victoria found herself stationed at the expediting station with Marcus, learning how orders flowed through the kitchen. The position offered a perfect view of how all the different elements came together: the coordination between front and back of house, the timing of dishes, the constant communication that kept everything moving smoothly. "In the military," Marcus explained as they worked, "we had a saying, 'Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.' Watch how the kitchen operates. Nobody's rushing, nobody's panicking. They're moving with purpose, with awareness, with trust in each other's capabilities." Victoria observed as orders began coming in. The kitchen staff called out their communications clearly, each person acknowledging the other's messages. When a problem arose, a dropped plate, a timing issue, there was no blame, no shouting. Instead, there was immediate cooperation to solve the issue and keep moving forward. "I've been mistaking chaos for efficiency," Victoria realized. "In my office, there's always a crisis, always someone to blame, always a fire to put out. But this is real efficiency. It's built on preparation, communication, and trust." 1 week after her first morning at Azure, Victoria stood before her team in the conference room. Gone was her usual power suit and intimidating stance at the head of the table. Instead, she wore business casual attire and had arranged the chairs in a circle, eliminating the physical hierarchy she had always insisted upon. The confusion on her employees' faces was evident. They exchanged uncertain glances as she began speaking, her voice carrying a new quality they had never heard before: warmth, genuine interest, and vulnerability. "Before we begin," Victoria said, "I owe all of you an apology." The room fell, completely silent. Victoria Hartford apologizing. It was unprecedented. "I've been leading this team through fear and intimidation, believing that was the path to success. I was wrong." She thought about Marcus and his kitchen team, about the genuine respect and cooperation she had witnessed. "Starting today, we're going to do things differently. I want to hear your ideas, your challenges, your suggestions for improvement. This isn't about maintaining appearances or power dynamics. It's about building something meaningful together." To demonstrate her commitment, Victoria shared the story of her experience at Azure, of learning about true leadership from a Navy SEAL turned restaurateur. She told them about her brother Thomas, about the years she had wasted pursuing the wrong kind of success, about the lessons she was still learning. "Earlier this week, I visited my brother and his family for the first time in years," she revealed, pulling up a photo on her phone. "My niece Madison taught me how to make friendship bracelets, and my nephew Tyler showed me his collection of toy soldiers. They showed me more about joy and genuine connection in one afternoon than I've experienced in years of corporate success." As she spoke, Victoria noticed the tension in the room beginning to dissolve. One of her junior executives, Sarah Chen, raised her hand tentatively. In the past, Victoria would have seen this as a challenge to her authority. Now she welcomed it with an encouraging smile. "Ms. Hartford," Sarah began, then corrected herself when Victoria gestured. "Victoria, I have some ideas about improving our client engagement process. I've been afraid to bring them up before, but please share them, Victoria. Encouraged. And afterward, I'd love to hear about the charity work you do with veterans. Marcus mentioned you volunteer at the VA hospital. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise that Victoria knew this detail about her life. The conversation opened up from there, with team members gradually sharing both professional insights and personal stories. Victoria learned that her technical director had served in the Air Force, that one of her analysts was working on a degree in social work at night, that her office manager was raising her granddaughter alone. These weren't just employees anymore. They were people with rich, complex lives, with valuable perspectives shaped by their experiences. Victoria thought about how Marcus had known every member of his staff, not just as workers, but as individuals, with unique stories and contributions. Later that afternoon, Victoria visited Azure again, not as a customer or trainee, but as someone seeking counsel. She found Marcus in his office, reviewing invoices with the same focused attention he gave to everything else. The morning meeting went well, she told him, accepting his offer of coffee, served in the same simple mugs the staff used. It was different, better, but I know this is just the beginning. Marcus nodded approvingly. The hardest part of change isn't starting, it's maintaining consistency when things get challenging. In the SEALs, we learned that character reveals itself under pressure. The real test will come when deadlines loom, when profits dip, when the temptation to revert to old habits grows strong. Victoria understood. She had already felt that temptation earlier when a client had demanded impossible deadlines. Her instinct had been to push her team harder, to revert to intimidation tactics. Instead, she had gathered them together, explained the situation honestly, and asked for their input. The solution they developed collaboratively was better than anything she could have forced through authority alone. I'm learning to trust the process, she said. Just like in your kitchen, preparation, communication, mutual respect. It feels strange sometimes, like I'm learning to walk again, but it also feels right. That's the thing about real leadership, Marcus replied. It's not about having all the answers. It's about creating an environment where answers can emerge from the collective wisdom and effort of the team. 6 months after her transformative evening at Azure, Victoria stood in her office looking out over the Boston skyline. The view hadn't changed, but her perspective had shifted dramatically. The office itself reflected this transformation. Gone were the intimidating dark leather chairs and stark minimalist decor. Instead, the space now featured comfortable seating, arranged for conversation, and the walls displayed photos of team celebrations and community service events. On her desk sat a framed picture from last weekend's company barbecue, where she had hosted her entire team and their families at her home. In the photo, she was wearing jeans and a casual shirt, helping Tyler and Madison, her niece and nephew, make s'mores, while Thomas manned the grill. Her employees' children played together on her previously immaculate lawn, and nobody worried about maintaining professional distance. A knock at her door drew her attention. Sarah Chen, now promoted to Director of Client Relations, entered with a familiar, excited energy. "Victoria, you need to see this," she said, handing over a report. "Our client satisfaction scores are up 40% from last quarter, and employee retention has improved by 65%. Victoria smiled, remembering how such meetings used to go, her sitting. Behind her imposing desk, employees standing nervously before her. Now, she gestured to the comfortable chairs by the window. "Tell me more. What do you think is driving these changes?" Sarah settled into one of the chairs. "It's everything, really. The new collaborative approach, the focus on work-life balance, the mentorship program. People feel heard, valued. They're bringing their whole selves to work, not just their professional facades." The mentorship program had been inspired by Marcus's approach at Azure. Victoria had paired experienced team members with newer employees, encouraging knowledge sharing and personal growth. She'd even started a veteran recruitment initiative after learning how many valuable skills military service members brought to civilian workplaces. "Have you heard from the team about next month's service project?" Victoria asked. They had begun organizing monthly volunteer activities, often working with veteran organizations that Thomas had connected them with. "Everyone's excited," Sarah replied, "especially about partnering with Azure's staff to serve dinner at the VA hospital. Marcus's team is handling the food, and our people will help with setup, service, and spending time with the veterans." Victoria felt a surge of pride. The partnership with Azure had grown beyond her personal transformation. Marcus had become a valued mentor, not just to her, but to her entire organization. His team regularly collaborated with hers on community initiatives, creating bridges between the corporate and service worlds she had once seen as completely separate. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Dad would be proud of you, Vic." Attached was a photo of their father's military medals, which she had recently helped Thomas display properly in his home office. Their father had served in Vietnam, something Victoria had never fully appreciated until now. She found herself wondering what conversations they might have had if she'd been open to understanding his experience earlier. "Oh, and one more thing," Sarah added, pulling Victoria from her reflection. "Remember that client who always demanded preferential treatment and rushed deadlines? The one who used to make the junior staff cry?" Victoria nodded, remembering how she had once encouraged such behavior, seeing it as a sign of their firm's exclusive status. "He came in yesterday, started his usual routine," Sarah continued. "But instead of accommodating his demands, we had that honest conversation about mutual respect and realistic expectations that you taught us. And you know what? He actually listened. By the end of the meeting, he was asking about our veteran hiring program and wanting to implement something similar at his company." This was perhaps the most significant change, the ripple effect of their transformed culture reaching beyond their own organization. Clients, partners, even competitors had noticed the shift in their approach and the improved results it brought. Later that evening, Victoria visited Azure for dinner, not at her old power table, but at the kitchen counter where she could watch the coordinated dance of service she had come to admire. Marcus joined her during a quiet moment. "Your brother tells me you're speaking at the Military Leadership Symposium next month," he said, sliding a coffee across the counter, still in the simple mug she had come to prefer over fine china. Victoria nodded. "About transitioning military leadership principles to corporate environments, though honestly I feel like I'm still learning every day." 1 year to the day after her transformative encounter at Azure, Victoria found herself back at the same table where it had all begun. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Thomas sat beside her, their spouses and children filling the rest of the table with warmth and laughter. At the adjacent table, members of her corporate team shared dinner with Azure's staff. Boundaries between the two worlds had long since dissolved. The restaurant hummed with its usual efficient energy, but Victoria now understood the deeper rhythms beneath the surface. She watched Amanda, now in her final year of medical school, expertly managing her section while discussing a challenging case with one of Victoria's senior executives who served on the hospital board. "Remember that first night?" Marcus asked, and pulling up a chair. He still wore the same style of casual attire that had once offended her sensibilities. Now she understood it as a badge of his authentic leadership, always ready to step in and work alongside his team. "How could I forget?" Victoria smiled, watching her niece Madison proudly showing off the friendship bracelet she'd made for Marcus. "I was so wrong about, everything." "Not everything," Marcus corrected. You had drive, determination, attention to detail. You just needed to redirect those qualities towards something more meaningful than power and status. Victoria nodded, thinking about how her life had changed. Her company had actually become more successful since she'd transformed its culture, but that seemed almost secondary now. The real victories were in the lives touched, the connections made, the barriers broken down. "Tell them about the new initiative," Thomas encouraged, bouncing his young son on his knee. Victoria shared a look with Marcus before addressing the table. "We're launching a joint venture," she announced, "a leadership academy that combines military veterans' expertise with corporate resources. It's going to offer training, mentorship, and job placement services. The goal," Marcus added, "is to bridge the gap between military service and civilian leadership, to show corporations what real leadership looks like while helping veterans translate their skills into business success." The program had grown from their shared realization that both worlds had something valuable to teach each other. Victoria's corporate connections combined with Marcus's military network created opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. "But that's not all," Victoria continued, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a leather-bound journal. Thomas immediately recognized it as similar to the one he'd kept during his deployment. "We're publishing a book, Beyond Authority, Leadership Lessons from the Kitchen and the Battlefield. Marcus and I have been working on it for months." The book had started as a simple documentation of her own journey, but had evolved into something larger. It included stories from Azure's staff, from her corporate team, from military veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian leadership roles. Each chapter ended with practical lessons and exercises for readers to implement in their own lives. "The proceeds," Marcus explained, "will fund scholarships for veterans pursuing culinary or business education. We're creating a pathway for others to experience the same kind of transformation." Victoria watched as her nephew Tyler listened intently to one of the line cooks explaining how the kitchen communication system worked, the same system she had once dismissed as too informal. The boy's eyes shone with admiration as the cook showed him his military challenge coins, explaining what each one meant. "You know what the best part is?" Thomas said, drawing her attention back to the conversation. "Madison told her class. She wants to be just like Aunt Victoria when she grows up, but the new version, not the old one," he added with a laugh. Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said softly. The comment hit home because she barely recognized her old self anymore. The woman who had walked into Azure that first night, full of judgment and false pride, seemed like a stranger. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus raised his glass. "To transformation," he said, "and to the understanding that true leadership isn't about the power you hold over others, but the strength you find in serving them." The tables around them joined in the toast. Azure staff, corporate executives, family members, all united in a way that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Victoria looked around at the faces of people who had become more than employees or colleagues. They were a community, bound together by shared values and mutual respect. Later that evening, as the gathering was winding down, a young woman in business attire approached their table. Victoria recognized the familiar signs of someone trapped in the same mindset she had once embraced. The rigid posture, the carefully manufactured confidence, the subtle disdain for those she deemed beneath her. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying that same tone Victoria had once used. "I need to speak to the manager about the inappropriate attire of your staff." Victoria caught Marcus's eye and saw the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She stood up, straightened her casual shirt, and extended her hand to the woman. "Why don't you join us?" she offered. "There's something important you need to learn about real leadership and the true meaning of service." And so, the cycle of transformation began again, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of humility and the willingness to see the world through new eyes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.